Today I am going to share 3 stories that are about people who have a lot of experience in a particular area. But their expertise, and really their confidence surrounding their expertise, is actually exactly the thing that causes them to make a disastrous mistake. But before we get into today's stories, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place because that is all we do and we upload multiple times every single week. So, if that is of interest to you, the next time you are at the Like Button's house, sneak into their kitchen and steal all of their forks. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One evening in November of 1972, a 68-year-old man named Demetrius Matura hurried around his small room at a boarding house in Stoke-on-Trent, England, pouring salt all over the floor. And as he did this, he looked out the window and saw the fading daylight and knew he had to hurry. However, running around like this was really taxing, especially on his lungs because for decades he had worked in this very dusty pottery factory, and it had really taken a toll on him. So moving faster was really hard to do. But he really needed to push through the pain and the discomfort and finish what he was doing before it got dark out. Because when it got dark out, that was when the vampires came out. So Demetrius had immigrated from Poland about 25 years earlier, seeking a peaceful life away from the trauma of war. He was a quiet, unassuming man who kept to himself. In his home country of Poland, vampires were not just some fun Halloween lore, but actually they were a huge part of the local culture and were often spoken about by older generations as being very real, terrifying dangers that people should be scared of. He had grown up listening to stories from his grandparents about the undead rising from their graves in the night to feed on the living. These were not considered fairy tales in his rural Polish village. They were treated as historical facts and active threats. And recently, Demetrius, despite now living in England, of course, he had begun hearing about a lot of vampire sightings here. A few years ago, he started noticing these news reports about a vampire that was living in London's Highgate Cemetery. The media was filled with sensational stories of ghost hunters, exorcists, and crowds of people flocking to the cemetery at night with wooden stakes. And also around the same time he began seeing those reports, he also learned about these 2 young girls who had reportedly been attacked by a vampire in the English countryside. And Demetrius, he just could not believe how people were just not that panicked about this. I mean, Demetrius was terrified. You know, he had grown up being scared of vampires, so that obviously played a massive role in his reaction to these sightings now in England. But still, he was thinking like, why aren't more people scared about this? But even more than that, when Demetrius would actually try to talk about these vampire concerns that he had with people in England, he found most people thought it was fake. They thought that these news reports and all that stuff, it was just made up. It was fake, and then they would kind of look at Demetrius as sort of like an idiot for thinking that that was real. Like, come on, vampires aren't real. The local kids in his neighborhood would sometimes see him carrying bags of garlic from the market, and they would shout names at him or throw pebbles at his window. He felt incredibly isolated, living in a foreign country where nobody took his fears seriously. But to Demetrius, he just felt like, you know what, those people who don't believe in this very real threat that obviously is getting worse here, those people, they are the idiots, not him. And so Demetrius, instead of trying to defend his position or try to convince anyone to believe what he believed, he decided to just do what he had to do to protect himself. And he knew exactly what to do. So Demetrius, he had a whole routine of things he would do to protect himself from vampires when he was living in Poland. And mostly he had abandoned that routine when he came to England. But now, you know, since these sightings, he had brought back that routine, and it was very extensive. He had added on to it, made it more elaborate. But it was something he now did every single night because vampires only come out at night. And so that is when you need protection. So before Demetrius climbed in bed at night, he would pour salt all around the room. He had a large paper sack of table salt, and despite his aching knees and the terrible tightness in his chest, he would bend down and carefully draw a thick, unbroken white line along the baseboards, across the threshold of his door, and underneath the windowsill. He believed that no creature of the dark could cross a threshold protected by salt without first counting every single grain, a task that would take them until the morning sun destroyed them. And he would also scatter fresh garlic cloves everywhere, since those were both very toxic to vampires. He would peel the cloves with his worn, calloused hands, placing them on his wardrobe on his bedside table, and in the corners of his room, and then after that, he would go up to each of the wooden and metal crosses that he had hung on his walls to make sure they were properly secured and perfectly straight because crosses are known deterrents to vampires. He would touch each one and whisper a prayer in Polish, asking for protection from the forces of evil. And then typically after checking all the crucifixes, he would go around and maybe do a little more salt, a few more garlic cloves, and then once everything was in place and secure, he would climb into bed. But before he lay his head on the pillow, he would take one large, peeled clove of raw garlic and place it directly into his mouth, wedging it carefully underneath his tongue. He believed that if a vampire somehow bypassed the salt, the garlic on the windows, and the holy crosses, and tried to bite his neck or breathe into his mouth while he slept, the raw clove would serve as an impenetrable final line of defense. The moment his head hit the pillow, he would feel his heart rate finally start to settle down because he knew that at least for this night he would be safe. And so in November of 1972, Demetrius just continued every night doing his vampire protection procedure. And even though some people thought this was very strange and very paranoid of him, because vampires aren't real, right? Well, it wasn't hurting anyone, Demetrius felt better when he did it. It was just sort of his own thing, and so he just continued to do it, and it didn't cause any problems until November 24th of that year. So on that day, just before 10 p.m., Police Constable John Pye of the Stoke-on-Trent Police Department, he walked up to the entrance of Demetrius's boarding house. The weather was typical for a late November night in England, cold, damp, and misty. Pye was here to do a wellness check because the landlady of this place had called the station to tell them that she hadn't seen one of her tenants, Demetrius Matura, in about a week and was starting to worry about him. Usually, Demetrius would come down to pay his rent on time or walk to the corner store, but his room had remained entirely silent and dark for days. The landlady had knocked on his door multiple times over the course of the week, but she never heard any movement inside. The milk bottles on his doorstep had gone untouched, and a layer of dust had begun to settle on his mailbox. Worried that the elderly man might have suffered a medical emergency, she decided to call the authorities. So now Pye knocked on the front door, and a few seconds later this older woman swung it open and she introduced herself as the landlady, and then she let Pye inside and led him down a hallway and stopped in front of Demetrius's door. And so Pye knocked and he called out to Demetrius, announcing that he was the police and he was just here to make sure he was okay. But there was no sound coming from inside the room. Pye listened closely, but he couldn't hear any footsteps, any breathing, or any movement at all. And then when Pye reached down and tried the handle, he found it was locked. And so after knocking a few more times and calling out and still not hearing anything from inside, Pye told the landlady to go ahead and step back because he was going to knock this door down. So Pye, he leaned back and then rammed his shoulder against the door, and actually it swung open really quickly, the lock splintering out of the wooden frame. And immediately Pye and the landlady were hit with this incredibly strong, overpowering smell of garlic that was coming out of the very dark room in front of them. The air was thick, heavy, and stale, smelling of rotting herbs and dampness. And so Pye immediately yells into the room for Demetrius, but there is no response. And so Pye, he reaches in and tries to find a light switch, and he does. And he flips it on, but it wasn't working for some reason. So Pye, he pulled out his flashlight off his belt, he clicked it on, and then he walked into the room. And right away, Pye felt like this small, dark room was the most bizarre, creepy space he had ever been inside of. There was what appeared to be white salt scattered all over the floorboards like a light dusting of snow. And there were also cloves of garlic everywhere, not just on the ground, but also up on windowsills, on top of the furniture, and near the door. And then at some point, Pye swept his flashlight beam from the wall over to the bed in the back of this room. It was basically like a one-room apartment. And he sees the bed, and he sees there was a definitive human-sized lump under the sheets. And so right away, he had a good sense of what it was. And so Pye, he walked across the floor, his boots crunching on the salt and crushing the shriveled garlic cloves as he went. And when he reached the bed, he pulled back the sheets, and under the sheets was the very obviously dead body of Demetrius Matura. Pye heard the sound of the landlady who had followed him inside by this point. She gasped because she was seeing, what was inside of her boarding house here. And at this point, even though Pye was very sure Demetrius was dead, just to be sure, he reached down and he felt for a pulse, but there was none. And also Demetrius's skin was very cold and very pale. However, despite how very obviously deceased Demetrius was, Pye looked around and couldn't really make sense of exactly how he had died. I mean, there was no denying that he was in a very strange location, but he couldn't really picture how the salt and the garlic and the crosses could have had anything to do with his death. Maybe it was just the paranoia of a dying man who crawled into bed and he died in here or something, but it was like there was no visible wounds, there was no blood anywhere, there was nothing. It was just this weird, creepy room this guy was in, and he was just dead under the sheets. It was just bizarre, but there was one thing about Demetrius that in Pye's mind was pretty disturbing. I mean, even more so than what he was already seeing. And that was that Demetrius, he had died with this terrified-looking expression on his face, like his mouth was wide open, like it was frozen as if he had been screaming as he took his final breath. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring directly at the ceiling. This made Pye wonder if maybe when he died, his death had been quite painful or just terrifying. Like maybe Demetrius had seen something as he died. Was he scared of something as he was dying that caused his face to sort of freeze in this expression? However, that made Pi think that maybe this was a homicide. You know, that the victim Demetrius was scared of the attacker, and that's why he looked the way he did. The attacker is attacking him, and he is reacting. But Pi was looking at the body thinking, I don't think this was a homicide because there's just no injury anywhere. So, what would the attacker have done? Like, how could they have forcibly killed Demetrius without leaving any marks anywhere? Now, Pi knew he was not going to get any real answers here without an autopsy. But while he was here, he could at least do a search of the room and also canvass the neighbors, starting with the landlady. So he turned to the visibly shocked landlady and asked her like, hey, what's the deal with all the salt and the crosses and the garlic? Like, what's that about? And surprisingly, she shrugged it off like it was just no big deal. It's just what Demetrius did. And when Pi was like, what do you mean? She explained that Demetrius had a really serious phobia of vampires, and these were measures he took to protect himself from vampires. For a second, Pi just stared back at her like he couldn't believe what he was being told. But then he was also thinking like, all right, I'm looking around the room, this is already totally weird. So, actually, in a way, that sort of tracks. However, Pi wasn't sure if Demetrius's apparent delusion around vampires really had anything to do with Demetrius's death or not, or if this was just a quirk of the case that this man died, however he died, and also was scared of vampires. He didn't know. But for now, Pi was just incredibly curious and absolutely determined to get answers. The landlady, whose name was Mrs. Gable, remembered how polite Demetrius had always been when he first arrived. She would sometimes bring him a bowl of hot potato soup on the cold, damp winter evenings, trying to make the lonely immigrant feel welcome in his new home. But as his paranoia grew, he would only open the door a crack, thank her quickly in his thick Polish accent, and shut the door before she could see inside. Even then, the sharp, pungent aroma of garlic would leak out into the hallway, lingering in the air for hours. A little over a month later, Police Constable Pi was sitting at his desk in police headquarters reading a library book about vampires. So, Demetrius's case was actually on pause while Pi waited for the autopsy results. But even though he really couldn't do much until those results came in, Pi himself just couldn't stop thinking about Demetrius's creepy room and all his vampire stuff. And so on his own, Pi had become a little bit obsessed. He had spent his evenings reading historical accounts of Eastern European vampire folklore, trying to understand the mindset of the man who had turned his room into a fortress. He sat at a small wooden desk under a single hanging bulb, turning the yellowed pages of an old book on supernatural beliefs. He read about the Vrikolakas and the Striga, ancient creatures believed to slip into the bedrooms of the sleeping and drain their life force through their breath. The text explained that placing a protective item like garlic inside the mouth was a desperate, extreme measure practiced only by those who felt completely defenseless, a detail that perfectly explained Demetrius's tragic state of mind during his final days. Now there was a possibility that Demetrius had simply died from some illness in his sleep. Pi had learned that Demetrius had actually been sick a lot before he died and that he'd worked in a pottery factory for decades, which really affected his lungs. So, Pi knew that it was entirely possible that Demetrius had some form of potter's rot, which was a lung disease that a lot of pottery workers got from the bad air in the factory. But potter's rot was like this slow-moving sort of compounding sickness. It was very progressive, but over a long period of time, and Demetrius apparently had died suddenly. And Pi had spoken to all of Demetrius's neighbors, and they all said, in the time leading up to his death, he wasn't showing any obvious sign of getting sick, or getting sicker, I should say, like there was no progression happening. He seemed normal, walking around and going about his daily routine, and then was just dead. So that sort of confirmed that potter's rot seemed unlikely as the immediate cause of death. Additionally, when Pi spoke to the neighbors, they also communicated that it didn't seem like Demetrius had any obvious enemies. He was a quiet, private man who mostly kept to himself, so the idea that there had been some kind of invisible foul play like poisoning also didn't really make sense. And so without any other theories to work on and without the autopsy results yet, Pi had been doing a lot of research on vampires. Now, he was certainly not about to consider that a real vampire had actually killed Demetrius, but the scene of Demetrius's death was just so weird that Pi couldn't get past the feeling that somehow vampires must have had something to do with his death. So far, though, his research really hadn't helped to clear that up. But just then, Pi's phone rang, and when he answered it, his heart began to race because it was the coroner. And the coroner said the autopsy was done. And the coroner told Pi that he was never going to believe what that autopsy had discovered. It would turn out Pi had been right. Vampires, or at least Demetrius's extreme fear of them, had everything to do with this death on the night that Demetrius died. He had done all the things he usually did to keep himself safe before he climbed in bed. But unlike the other nights when he had done this procedure, this night his routine had not worked. So Demetrius, along with spreading salt all over his room, also put garlic cloves everywhere since that was one of the most famous ways to ward off vampires. And so he did it every single night. And one of the places, in addition to the floor and the windowsills, that Demetrius would put these cloves at night, one of those places was his own mouth. He would place a raw, peeled garlic clove directly under his tongue. And he had become really good at keeping that garlic clove under his tongue while he was asleep. But on that night in November, something went wrong. While he slept, perhaps because of his compromised lungs and his tendency to gasp for air during the night, the clove slipped out from under his tongue, went down his throat, and got stuck. It completely blocked his trachea, cutting off his oxygen supply. He would have woken up in a state of absolute panic, unable to draw a single breath or call out for help. He would have struggled desperately, clawing at his throat, but with no air, he was completely paralyzed. His facial muscles froze in that state of ultimate terror, which explained the horrific expression on his face when Pi found him. And during the autopsy, the coroner literally found the clove still stuck there in his windpipe. And so it was determined that he had died from choking on it. So, while garlic cloves may have played a role in protecting Demetrius from the vampires of his imagination, unfortunately, it was literally the clove itself that killed him. Now we are going to travel back in time, all the way to the late 9th century, to the rugged highlands of Scotland. This is a story about a man who was an incredibly accomplished and powerful warrior, a leader who had spent his entire life conquering territories and outsmarting his enemies. But his confidence in his own superiority and his desire to humiliate a defeated foe would ultimately lead to a bizarre and painful death. This man was a Viking leader named Sigurd Eysteinsson, also known as Sigurd the Mighty. Sigurd was the Earl of Orkney, a powerful chieftain who ruled over the islands off the northern coast of Scotland. He was a man of immense physical strength and tactical brilliance, famous for his ruthless ambition. Under his leadership, the Vikings had successfully expanded their territory southward, raiding and conquering the northern mainland of Scotland. Sigurd was a man who believed he was completely invincible, and his past victories only served to reinforce this belief. He believed that the gods themselves favored his blade, and he walked with the posture of a man who could never be bested. His primary rival in northern Scotland was a Scottish chieftain named Mael Brigt, who ruled over the kingdom of Moray. Mael was a proud and stubborn leader, determined to protect his land and his people from the Norse invaders. But to the Vikings, and especially to Sigurd, Mael was not a respected adversary. He was seen as a loud, impulsive, and somewhat foolish man, and he was also famous for his physical appearance. Mael had two massive front teeth that protruded far over his bottom lip, which had earned him the nickname of Mael the Buck-Toothed. The conflict between Sigurd and Mael had been ongoing for some time, with both sides suffering losses. In an effort to resolve the dispute and decide who would rule the territory, the two leaders agreed to a meeting on a large field in northeastern Scotland. To limit the scale of the conflict, they agreed to a battle of champions. They would each bring exactly 40 of their best men to the field, and the two forces would fight until one side was victorious. This was supposed to be an honorable contest, a fair fight between equal numbers, but Sigurd was not a man who cared about honor or fair play. He was a conqueror, and he wanted to ensure that he won the battle with as few casualties to his own men as possible. He was so confident in his right to rule that he felt entirely justified in cheating. He gathered 80 of his fiercest Viking warriors and mounted them on 40 horses, with 2 men riding on each horse. He had his men ride close together, with the secondary riders sitting tightly behind the primary riders, blending into their shadows. From a distance, as they rode across the field, it appeared to be only 40 riders. Sigurd's horse was a massive, sturdy warhorse, bred to carry the heavy weight of a fully armored Viking warrior, but carrying 2 grown men into the chaos of battle was a severe strain. As the stallion galloped across the marshy Scottish ground, its hooves kicked up thick chunks of black mud, and the secondary riders struggled to maintain their balance, gripping the belts of the primary riders tightly. The battle itself was a symphony of violence. The heavy broadswords of the Vikings crashed against the iron-rimmed wooden shields of the Scots, creating a deafening din that echoed off the surrounding hills. Mael Brigt's warriors fought with the desperation of men defending their families, their spears thrusting through the gaps in the Viking lines. When Mael Brigt and his 40 Scottish warriors arrived at the designated meeting spot, they looked across the field and immediately realized that they had been deceived. They could see that each horse was carrying 2 fully armed Viking warriors. Mael was furious at this dishonorable treachery, but he was also a proud and brave leader. He turned to his men and told them that they had been betrayed, but that they would not run. He rallied them to fight with everything they had to make the Vikings pay for their dishonor with their lives. And so the battle began. It was a brutal and chaotic clash of iron and wood. Swords clashed against shields, axes tore through chainmail, and the ground quickly became slick with mud and blood. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, Mael's men fought with a wild, desperate ferocity that shocked the Vikings. They cut down many of Sigurd's men, refusing to yield an inch of ground. They formed a tight, defensive wall of shields, fighting with a fierce determination to protect their homeland, but eventually, the sheer numerical advantage of the Vikings began to take its toll. The Scottish warriors were surrounded and cut down one by one. Sigurd himself, wielding his massive sword, searched the battlefield for Mael. When he found him, the two leaders engaged in a fierce, desperate duel. Mael fought bravely, but Sigurd was younger, stronger, and far more experienced. With a powerful blow, Sigurd knocked Mael's weapon from his hand and then struck him down, killing him. When Sigurd finally cut Mael down, the Scottish chieftain fell into the wet heather, his famous buck teeth glistening with spit and blood under the pale Scottish sky. Horrors later, Sigurd was still on his horse, but this time he was leading what remained of his victorious Viking army down a dirt road away from the battlefield and back towards their camp. Sigurd, like basically all of his men, was totally exhausted. But he was also full of adrenaline because the battle was over and it had gone exactly the way he knew it would. His soldiers had completely destroyed Mael and his army, and he, Sigurd, had personally killed Mael. And so now, as Sigurd rode along here, he looked down at Mael's severed head, which he himself had removed from his adversary's body. He had attached the head to his saddle, right next to his stirrup, so it was dangling near his leg. He looked down at the head, and the head's dangling near his legs. And you know, Mael's eyes are wide open and looking vacantly up at Sigurd, and his mouth was wide open as well, which only made his front teeth look even bigger and hang out even more. And as Sigurd gazed down at this head, he couldn't help but smile as a wave of just pure satisfaction washed over him. During their pre-battle negotiations, Mael had just been unbearably annoying and offensive. And so Sigurd was thrilled he'd gotten the best of him and now had his head dangling right near his legs. Like, that is just perfect for Sigurd. And now that Mael the Bucktoothed was dead, Sigurd was one step closer to conquering all of Scotland. So he gave out this loud, triumphant war cry, and his men answered him with cheers. But then Sigurd spurred his horse into a full gallop. The long ride back to the settlement took them through the winding, desolate passes of the highlands, the cold mountain wind whistling through the valley as the severed head bounced rhythmically against Sigurd's calf. However, just a few days later, everything had changed for Sigurd. By this point, Sigurd was now laying under a wool blanket in the stone shack in one of his Scottish settlements, and he was screaming in pain because over the last couple of days, he'd gotten incredibly sick. And now he was delirious, and he had such a bad fever that he was both covered in sweat and also shivering nonstop. And then at some point, the doctor who had been taking care of Sigurd came into the shack to check on him. And after looking him over, the doctor just shook his head and told Sigurd that he had done all he could, but this sickness, whatever it was going to kill him. And Sigurd, when he heard this, felt nothing but rage. Not because he was dying, but because he knew that he'd actually been very wrong. He had not gotten the best of Mael the Bucktoothed. Mael the Bucktoothed had clearly gotten the best of him. So it would turn out after the big battle, after, Sigurd had won so triumphantly, as he was riding along, carrying along with him the head of his adversary, Mael's severed head. Well, as he began galloping faster and faster, and he's cheering for his men, they're so triumphant, and everyone's cheering along. As he's going faster and faster, the severed head, began bouncing, because of the movement. And remember, Mael's got those big two front teeth. He's got a nickname, Mael the Bucktoothed, for a reason. Well, those teeth, as the head jostled around, began puncturing Sigurd's thigh. And he didn't notice it because he was so jacked up on adrenaline. He's galloping off, shouting in victory. He looks down and sees blood all over his legs, and he's thinking it's got to be Mael's blood from the fact that his head's been cut off. But no, it was actually Sigurd's blood from the punctures from Mael's buck teeth. And because the mouth of a dead warrior on a muddy battlefield is full of lethal, putrid bacteria, those punctures became horribly infected. The bacteria entered his deep tissues, causing a rapid onset of necrotizing fasciitis, a severe flesh-eating disease. Without any antibiotics to cure the infection, the bacteria spread rapidly through Sigurd's bloodstream, causing severe sepsis. And so in the end, even though Sigurd did successfully kill Mael and win the battle, it would turn out that Mael wasn't done with Sigurd. Mael ultimately caused Sigurd's death because those punctures got horribly infected and Sigurd died a painful death. His dream of conquering northern Scotland died with him as the territory he had fought so hard to seize quickly fell back into the hands of the Scots, leaving his legacy forever overshadowed by the buck teeth of a dead man. This bizarre story was recorded in the Orkneyinga Saga, a historical narrative of the Orkney Islands, serving as a warning to all future warriors about the dangers of excessive pride and the unpredictable nature of fate. Now we are going to move forward to the 20th century, to the hot summer of 1978 in Spain. This is a story about a man who was an expert in his field, a veteran long-haul truck driver who believed that his decades of experience made him immune to the basic rules of safety. He thought he knew better than the regulations, better than the safety inspectors, and better than the young coworkers who tried to warn him. But his confidence would ultimately lead to one of the most horrific industrial disasters in Spanish history. Around 2 p.m. on July 11th, 1978, a man named Francisco Bernón Belenia drove down a highway a few miles outside of the coastal town of La Repita, Spain. Earlier, Francisco had left the warehouse where he worked, and he was now driving back toward the city where he lived. And so far, this drive had been very uncomfortable and sweaty since it was really hot out today, and he didn't have air conditioning in his truck. And also, he was just very annoyed because before he had left the warehouse, he'd gotten into a disagreement with another employee. So Francisco was in his 50s and he had been doing his job for years. He was a veteran driver, highly experienced in transporting specialized, dangerous cargo, and while for sure he was a bit of a curmudgeon about certain things, he was also really experienced and self-sufficient. But for some reason, this other younger guy, this coworker of his who worked in a completely different department, had felt the need to micromanage him and start telling Francisco how to do his job, and he'd even had the audacity to tell Francisco that if he didn't listen to him, listen to this criticism and change your behavior. If you don't do that, you're going to regret it. Needless to say, Francisco did not appreciate being told how to do his job, especially by some young idiot who had only been with the company for a short time compared to Francisco's long career. And so in the moment during their confrontation, Francisco had simply ignored the other employee and kept doing his work. But in reality, the whole thing had really bothered him. And even now, as he drove down the highway, it was all he was thinking about. He was just totally stewing over what this guy told him. Up ahead, Francisco noticed a sign that said a few toll booths were coming up, and now Francisco felt a whole new wave of irritation about these stupid tolls. He thought they were a complete ripoff, just another way for the government to squeeze money out of hardworking drivers. And so he made a point to never pay them if he could help it. And luckily for Francisco, on this particular route, he did know a way around these tolls. It was a back route, a national road called the N340, which did take a bit longer, but it saved him money. Plus, it ran right by the ocean, so it was very scenic. And so at the next exit, he pulled off the highway and began taking this long cut. About half an hour later, around 2:30 p.m., Francisco drove down a narrow road that ran right along the ocean. And as he did this, Francisco, if this was even possible by this point, felt even more annoyed. He had been hoping by the time he got down here that there would be some kind of sea breeze to cool him down because there was no air conditioning in the truck cab. But it was somehow, despite being near the ocean here, it was somehow even hotter than when he had been out on the highway. The sun was beating down relentlessly, heating the metal of his truck to scorching temperatures. Just up ahead, there was this very popular campground called Los Alfax. It was this expansive field right next to the beach that was full of camper vans, caravans, and tents, and there were also a few businesses like restaurants and a general store that served the grounds. And Francisco saw that this afternoon the area was absolutely packed. There were hundreds of people, mostly families from France, Germany, and Belgium, who were enjoying their summer holidays. They were just hanging around their campsites, cooking food on small portable grills, playing games, and swimming in the ocean. And as Francisco drove past, all he began to think was how great it would be if he could just pull over for a second and take a plunge in the water himself and actually cool off. He was letting his mind wander, sort of wishing this ride was less miserable than it had been so far when an odd sound caught his attention. It was like this metallic groaning sound, like thick steel being twisted and strained under immense force, and at first he couldn't even place it. He had no idea what it was, and pretty quickly the sound went away. So he just continued driving along, assuming it was just some minor mechanical noise from the road. But then he heard it again, except this time it was much louder, and this time Francisco did know what it was. But it was already too late. Just seconds later, people in towns miles away from the campground where Francisco was passing by heard this deafening, earth-shaking boom. And from all directions, everyone turned towards Los Alfax just in time to see this enormous fireball rise into the air like a huge mushroom cloud. It looked like a massive bomb had literally gone off. But before anybody could make sense of this, there was another explosion and then another and another. It was like this rapid-fire chain of blasts that boomed over the campground one after another for several minutes. And then finally, when it all went quiet, there was just a massive column of flames and thick black smoke and ash soaring into the sky over this campground and the beach. Within minutes, emergency response units from all the surrounding towns descended on the campground to try to figure out what had happened and to see if anyone was still alive. But when they actually got there and saw the devastation, they couldn't believe their eyes. The scale of the tragedy was almost incomprehensible. There were all these blackened, charred bodies scattered everywhere across the field. They were all contorted from the intense heat of the blast. And some of these victims were even still sitting in the remains of their plastic camp chairs, as if they had been instantly carbonized in place when the fireball first swept through. The heat had been so intense that it had literally vaporized their tents and melted the metal frames of their caravans. Now, that was horrifying enough what they saw up on the field, but what first responders saw down on the beach and in the water was even worse. Along the shoreline were the bodies of dozens of people who had been swimming in the ocean when the explosion occurred. They had run into the water to escape the flames, thinking the sea would protect them. But the thermal radiation from the massive gas fireball had been so extreme that it had heated the shallow water near the shore to boiling temperatures. These poor tourists had clearly been boiled alive in the ocean. The destruction at this entire site was so complete, so total, that first responders really couldn't even begin to guess what had happened beyond obviously some kind of massive chemical explosion. The task of deciphering what had actually happened would take investigators several days of painstaking forensic work. And what they would discover was that it all came back to that fight that Francisco Bernal Belania had had with the younger employee before he left the warehouse. So, on the day of this catastrophe, it was true that Francisco was on his way back home from the warehouse. He had left work and he was going home, but he was not driving a regular truck. It was not a personal vehicle. Francisco was a long-haul truck driver, and he was driving a specialized tanker truck designed to transport highly hazardous materials. His cargo that day was pressurized liquid propylene, which is an extremely flammable and volatile liquefied gas. Earlier that morning, the younger employee, who was a safety inspector at the refinery, had approached Francisco as he was loading his tanker. The young man had checked the gauges and warned Francisco that he had severely overfilled the tank. Francisco had loaded over 23 tons of liquid propylene into a tanker that had a maximum safe capacity of much less. More importantly, the safety regulations strictly required that at least 20% of the tanker's volume be left empty. This empty space, known as ullage, is critical because it gives the liquefied gas room to expand as the temperature rises. When liquefied gases are kept in a sealed container, they exist in a state of equilibrium between the liquid and the vapor. If the temperature outside the tank increases, the liquid expands. If there is no empty space left in the tank, the expanding liquid has nowhere to go. This causes the internal pressure to rise exponentially, a physical process that will inevitably lead to a catastrophic failure of the steel container. Propylene is a highly volatile hydrocarbon, and under standard atmospheric pressure, it exists as a gas. However, when stored under immense pressure inside a heavy steel tanker, it compresses into a liquid state. The moment the tank ruptured, the sudden drop in pressure caused the liquid to instantly flash boil back into a gas, a thermodynamic reaction that absorbs massive amounts of heat from the surrounding environment. This created a dense, freezing white fog of vaporized propylene that rolled silently across the highway and into the campsite. Some of the campers actually noticed this strange cold mist rolling over their sunbeds, thinking it was a bizarre coastal weather phenomenon or a misting system from a nearby resort, completely unaware that they were standing inside a massive bomb. But Francisco, with his decades of experience, had just brushed this young employee's warning off. He had shrugged and told him that drivers did this all the time. Overfilling the tank meant they could transport more gas in a single trip, which saved the company money and made the drivers look more efficient. Francisco was convinced that his practical experience was far more valuable than some safety manual written by bureaucrats. He believed that because he had done this many times before without an accident, nothing could go wrong. But Francisco had failed to account for one critical variable: the extreme heat of that July afternoon. As he drove the overfilled tanker down the coastal road past the Los Alfax campground, the ambient temperature rose to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The intense heat of the Spanish sun beat down directly on the steel tank. Inside, the liquid propylene began to expand rapidly. Because Francisco had left virtually no empty space for expansion, the pressure inside the tanker rose exponentially, far exceeding the structural limits of the steel. The strange metallic groaning sound Francisco had heard was the sound of the steel tank stretching and buckling under the unimaginable pressure. And when the tank finally ruptured, the pressurized liquid propylene instantly vaporized, creating a massive, highly flammable gas cloud that drifted over the highway and directly into the crowded campsite. When this cloud found an ignition source, it triggered a massive boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, or the resulting fireball was over a mile wide, instantly consuming everything in its path. The initial blast was followed by a series of secondary explosions as the gas cylinders and fuel tanks of the hundreds of caravans and camper vans detonated in a horrific chain reaction. Francisco himself was killed instantly, his truck completely vaporized in the epicenter of the blast. In the terrible days following the disaster, the local hospitals in Tarragona and Barcelona were completely overwhelmed, with patients suffering from third-degree burns over 90% of their bodies, prompting an international medical mobilization as burn specialists from across Europe rushed to Spain to assist the overtaxed medical staff. The subsequent investigation into the disaster would reveal that the trailer, manufactured by a company called Cisternas Ruano, lacked essential pressure relief valves. While this was actually legal under the regulations of the time, the absence of these safety valves meant that there was no way for the buildup of pressure to be relieved before the tank reached its breaking point. A legal trial followed the disaster, and the courts found both the refinery owners and the transport company guilty of severe negligence for allowing the truck to be dangerously overloaded. The court ordered massive compensation payments to the families of the victims. In the end, Francisco's supreme confidence in his own expertise and his stubborn refusal to listen to a younger colleague's warning cost him his life and resulted in the deaths of over 200 innocent vacationers. The disaster at Los Alfax remains one of the worst transport accidents in history. It led to sweeping reforms across Spain and the rest of Europe, including the strict banning of hazardous cargo transportation on residential, urban, and highly populated tourist routes. It stands as a sobering, permanent reminder of the terrible and tragic cost of overconfidence. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!